Hey there, I'm Tatiana Mejia, passionate traveler and about cooking, and I found a way to blend my two greatest loves by creating the first gastronomic tourism agency in Latin America. Welcome to Bites and Sides, where we travel by eating and eat by traveling. In this space, I'll take you on a journey to discover gastronomic tourism, a one of a kind way to explore the world through its flavors, traditions, and local communities. When we talk about women's network in culinary tourism today, we're not just talking about cooking. We're talking about resilience, identity, the local economy, and women who for decades have quietly upheld much of the cultural heritage of our regions. In Latin America, millions of rural, indigenous, and Afro-descendant and peasant women have been the guardians of recipes, seeds, ancestral beverage, and traditional techniques that today represent an enormous cultural and tourism asset. However, for a long time, their work was rendered invisible, viewed solely as domestic labor rather than as a fundamental economic, cultural, and social contribution to the development of their communities. And this is where women's networks are beginning to change history. When women come together around cooking and their land, something powerful happens. Knowledge ceases to confined to a single home and begins to circulate. Opportunity ceases to be individual and become collective, and tourism ceases to be merely an economic activity and becomes a tool for social transformation. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, women play a vital role in rural food systems, yet they continue to have less access to financing, training, land, and commercial visibility. And this is also true in the realm of culinary tourism. Many traditional female cooks sustain entire tourist experiences without even appearing in the region's official promotional campaigns. That is why this episode is so important because we need to stop romanticizing traditional cuisine and start recognizing the structures that still limit many women who preserve our culinary heritage. Today, there are networks and associations demonstrating that another way of doing tourism is indeed possible. In Peru, for example, community kitchens projects and women's associations had succeeded in integrating rural culinary experiences into sustainable tourism routes. In Mexico, collectives of traditional cooks have gained international recognitions while defending native corn, ancestral techniques, and food sovereignty. In Colombia, more and more rural women are creating experiences where visitors come not only to eat, but also to understand the story, the land, and the struggles behind each dish. And here's something very important. These networks aren't driven solely by economic factors. They arise from the need for companionship because many women in rural areas face isolation, a lack of institutional support, and enormous difficulties in accessing markets or promoting tourism. These partnerships then become spaces for learning, mutual support, and collective growth. I myself, through my travels, have seen how the most transformative experiences arise precisely from these human connections. I remember conversations with women cooks who told me that they used to think their cooking had no value until other women came to teach them that their recipes were the living memory of the region, and that completely changed the way of a community perceives itself. This episode also aims to prompt reflection among governments, institutions, and tourism stakeholders because culinary tourism cannot continue to be built solely around high profile restaurants or major cities. We need public policies that truly empower the women who uphold traditional cuisines, that facilitate access to training, marketing, infrastructure, and meaningful participation within national tourism strategies. Because when a woman strengthens her kitchen, she doesn't just improve her economic situation, she also protects seeds, preserves traditions, passes on knowledge, and keeps the cultural identity of an entire region alive. And perhaps that is the key lesson of this episode, that the future of culinary tourism in Latin America is not built on individual competition, but on networks, collaboration, and women's ability to transform entire communities when they work together for the sake of flavor and their region. There is something profoundly powerful that happens when women stop seeing each other as competitors and start seeing each other as allies. And I believe that is one of the quietest yet most transformative revolutions currently taking place in culinary tourism in Latin America. Because for many years, when we talk about gastronomy, we talk about the renowned chef, the famous restaurant, the trendy tourist destination. But we rarely talk about the woman who truly upheld the culinary memory of these regions. The woman who planted, cooked, fermented, sold at markets, preserved ancestral recipes, and fed entire communities without ever appearing in any official photograph. And something that moves me deeply when I travel is realizing that many of those women never recognize themselves as bearers of cultural heritage. Imagine that for a moment. Women who inherited knowledge from entire generations, who can read the weather through the crops, who know the exact time for corn, cassava, cacao, coffee, and yet grew up thinking they just cook. I remember a very special conversation with a rural cook in Colombia who told me something I've never forgotten. She said to me, I thought my cooking was poor my whole life until travelers start coming and I realized that what I was doing was value. And that really struck a chord with me because I realized that often the problem isn't just financial, it's also a matter of recognition. And that's where women's network come in because a woman on her own can get tired, can feel afraid, may not know how to charge, how to sell, how to speak in front of a group of tourists. But when she finds another woman who have already walked the path, something changes. The experience ceases to be individual and begins to become collective. And this isn't just theory. It's happening all over Latin America. It's happening in Mexico with the traditional cooks who began organizing the project that protects native corn and prevent the recipes from being appropriated with recognition. And there's a story that I find deeply beautiful. The story of Abigail Mendoza, a Zapotec cook from Oaxaca who learned to cook by watching her mother and grandmother from the times she was a child. Abigail grew up understanding cooking not as a business, but as a way to preserve identity. For many years, indigenous cuisine was looked down up by certain urban sectors that consider foreign gastronomy or European techniques to be more important. But Abigail decided to do exactly the opposite: stay in her homeland, cook for her roots, and champion ancestral ingredients like native corn, mole, and traditional Zapotec dishes. And what's truly powerful about her story is that she never separated cooking from the community. While many culinary projects grew out of individualism, she kept alive a collective ethos where cooking also meant honoring those who came before. Today, she is internationally recognized, but most importantly, she paved the way for countless indigenous women to begin taking pride in their traditional cuisines. And here I want to share a curious fact that I find wonderful. In Oaxaca, there are more than 60 varieties of native corn. Just imagine that. More than 60 different forms of an ingredient that we often reduce to the simple just corn. And behind many of those seeds are women guardians who know exactly which variety is best for tortillas, which works best for atoles, which can withstand certain rainy seasons, and which has ceremonial uses. I find that fascinating because it reminds us that traditional cuisines are far more complex than we imagine. And if you ever visit Oaxaca, there's something I always recommend. Don't just stick to famous restaurants. Please, please go to the markets, listen to women selling ingredients, ask about the stories behind the moles, ask how they learn to cook, because often the most transformative conversations happen far from the most tourist spots. It's happening actually in Peru, where rural women's associations have transformed small homemade lunches into full-fledged community-based culinary tourism experiences. It's happening in Colombia with Afro-descendant women from the Pacific region who realized that their cuisine was not just food, but also history, resistance, and territory. And there's something very important. Many of these networks weren't created with tourism in mind, they were created with survival in mind. Because when a rural woman in Latin America remains extremely difficult. According to data from the UN Women and the FAO, rural women continues to have less access to land, financing, technical education, and political representation despite playing a fundamental role within food systems. Furthermore, much of the work related to food, caregiving, and supporting families remains unpaid. In other words, millions of women sustain their communities' food security without real economic recognition. And this is also reflected in culinary tourism. Sometimes we talk about the rise of Latin American cuisine as if it had appeared out of thin air, as if behind every dish there weren't decades of invisible work by women who kept recipes alive, even under extremely difficult conditions. And if one begins to look deeply into the history of Latin America, one understands that many of the cuisines we admire today survived thanks to women who silently endured extremely harsh conditions. Because behind every traditional recipe lies a history of, colonization, displacement, racism, poverty, and survival. Many of the Afro descendant dishes that are now part of Latin American culinary tourism were born out of suffering. They were created by women who had to reinvented ways of feeding their families using whatever ingredients were available, blending African traditions with local produce to feed entire communities aimed deeply on just conditions. And yet, those women managed to preserve culinary techniques, flavors, and cooking methods that today represent a fundamental part of our cultural identity. I think a lot, for example, about the women of the Colombian Pacific, and I also think a great deal about the matronas of the Colombian Caribbean, a network of traditional women cooks who decided to come together to defend something very important: the cultural and economic value of home cooking. For decades, many of them cooked in silence for their families and communities, without anyone recognizing that knowledge as cultural heritage. But little by little, they began to organize, share recipes, participate in festivals, and claim a place in country's culinary discourse. What is most powerful in that they are not only preserving traditional dishes, they are also defending the memory of Afro Caribbean women who historically sustained food and community care. And I think there is a profound reflection there. Don't you think so? Because domestic cooking was often downplayed precisely because it was associated with the feminine. However, today we understand that there was immense cultural richness there. When you arrive in the Pacific and hear the sound of pots mingling with the marimba, traditional songs, and the lapping of the water, you understand that their cooking was never just cooking. It was cultural resistance. And here I want to make a special musical recommendation. Listen to the cantaoras del Pacífico. Listen to Petrona Martinez. Listen to Totola Momposina. But don't just listen to them as background music. Listen to them as you try to understand the region, because those songs often speak of rivers, fishing, cooking, mourning, migration, and collective memory. And when you listen to that music, after having shared a traditional Pacific style meal, the experience changes completely. There are even women who cook while singing. Maybe you do, don't you? I like to cook while I sing, or sing while I'm cooking. Well, and I really find that profoundly beautiful, because it means that memory isn't just passed down through recipes, it's also passed down through rhythm, voice, and oral tradition. Many Afro Colombian women cooked for decades while facing state neglect, armed violence, and enormous social inequalities, and yet they preserve ancestral recipes based on coconut, fish, traditional herbs, encocados, medicinal drinks, and knowledge passed down orally. And here's something very powerful. Many of those women never appear in cookbooks or television shows or in culinary rankings, but without them, much of Colombian cuisine simply wouldn't exist. And also in other countries, not just Colombia. I remember a conversation with a cook from the Pacific region who told me something remarkable. We learn to cook by listening. Yeah, we learn to cook by listening. And when I asked her, "What do you mean?" she explained that in many communities, recipes weren't written down. Girls learn by watching, listening, smelling, and accompanying the older woman from a very young age. Imagine the cultural dip that exists there. We're talking about knowledge transmitted entirely through life experience. And that makes me think a lot about how we understand culinary heritage today, because we often believe that preserving a recipe is simply about preserving ingredients or techniques. But preserving a recipe also means preserving human relationships, ways of teaching, and collective memories. And here, women's networks play a fundamental role because they allow older women to teach younger generations. They allow the seeds to remain alive. They help ensure that cooking remains meaningful within communities. They help prevent recipes from disappearing. And few people talk about a key point. Many rural women not only preserve recipes, they also preserve biodiversity. For example, in the Colombian Amazon, there's a group of Ticuna indigenous women who have spent years recovering ancestral recipes, medicinal plants, and culinary knowledge passed down by their grandmothers. Many of them began to notice that younger generations no longer knew certain traditional ingredients or understood some of their communities' food rituals. And that is true. I have seen it in my works in the Amazon. So they decided to come together. And something truly beautiful about this process is that they began cooking together not only to feed people, but to document memory. Imagine that. Just imagine that. Women cooking while recalling stories from the past, while identifying medicinal plants, while explaining the purpose of each ingredient, while teaching techniques that have never been written down. That too is culinary tourism, because today many travelers come to these regions seeking precisely to understand that deep connection between food, the jungle, spirituality, and ancestral memory. And here I like to recommend a book that I think is essential to understanding that relationship between memory, cuisine, and woman, like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel. Or if you prefer, you can also watch the movie. Because beyond being a novel, it speaks to something deeply Latin America, how emotions, family wounds, and identity are also cooked. And I think that happens a lot in our traditional kitchens. There are recipes that taste like mourning. There are dishes that taste like celebrations. There are dishes that only appear at funerals, births, or community celebrations. Latin American cuisine is full of emotions. According to the FAO, rural and indigenous women play a central role in preserving traditional seeds and ancestral agricultural knowledge. This means that many women aren't just cooking ancestral recipes, they also are protecting the very existence of the ingredients themselves. Because without native seeds, countless traditional cuisines disappear. Without native corn, certain tamales and tortillas will disappear. Without native potatoes, Andean dishes will disappear. Without ancestral cacao, unique flavors will disappear. And here I want to share another impressive fact. In Peru, there are more than 4,000 varieties of native potatoes. Yeah, you heard well. 4,000. And many of those varieties survive thanks to the work of rural and indigenous communities where women play a fundamental role in seed conservation. So when a woman protects seeds, she actually is protecting culture. And here I want to mention something deeply inspiring, the gardens of Andean seeds. But I also want to tell you about a Colombian woman named Elvira Mesa. I find her story incredible because it shows how a woman's network can completely transform a region's economy and cultural identity. Elvira began by gathering women from her community in Pital de Megua in the Colombian Caribbean to prepare and sell traditional pastries by the side of the road. At first, it seemed like a small thing, a way to generate income, a way for them to help one another. But little by little, something much bigger took shape. The women began to organize themselves more effectively, share knowledge, work collectively, and turn a traditional dish into a cultural symbol of the region. Over time, the Pastel Festival was born, which today attracts visitors, boosts the local economy, and brings visibility to the work of women cooks who for years remain unseen. And honestly, I think that story perfectly illustrates what a woman's network can achieve when it realized that cooking can also contribute the regional development. And here's an important tip for those of you listening who love to travel. When you visit community food festivals, try to buy directly from local cooks and who produces the ingredients. Ask what story lies behind each dish because we often engage in culinary tourism without really asking ourselves who sustains that heritage. And I believe that's where conscious tourism begins as well. In various regions of Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia, there are networks of rural women dedicated to preserving ancestral agriculture varieties. Some of them preserve dozens of even hundreds of types of potatoes, corn, or beans that have survived for generations. And what's most interesting is that many have begun to link that knowledge with culinary tourism experiences. Now, travelers don't just come to eat, they also learn about biodiversity, ancestral agriculture, and food sovereignty. And that completely changed the tourism experience because the visitor says to be a passive consumer and begins to understand the cultural depth of the region. I also remember a very special experience in Osaka, Mexico. There, I met women who had been defending native corn for decades against the rise of industrial seeds and ultra processed foods. And what was most striking was hearing them talk about corn almost as if they were a member of the family. Yeah. One of them told me, if our corn disappears, our memory disappears. And that phrase stuck with me because it reveals something very profound. For many Latin America's communities, food is not simply consumption, it is identity, it is memory, it is territory. And here is something very important that culinary tourism urgently needs to understand. We cannot continue to talk about Latin America's cuisine while ignoring the women who sustain the agricultural, cultural, and emotional foundations of those cuisines, because we often see famous chefs reimprinting ancestral recipes while the women who preserve those recipes remain invisible. It cannot pass once again. And this opens up an uncomfortable but necessary conversation. I know it is about cultural appropriation. Who gets the recognition? Who gets the money? Who appears in the media? Who tells the story? And who is left silent once again? Because, yes, it is wonderful that Latin American cuisine is gaining international recognition, but that recognition should also include the communities. Yeah, the communities, and especially the women who have preserved these traditions for generations. And there's something else I feel is profoundly important to say. Women's networks aren't just revolutionizing culinary tourism through cooking, they are also revolutionizing it through care because women think about tourism differently, more humanly, more connected to the land, more aware of environmental and cultural limits. Many understand something the world is only just beginning to grasp, that there can be no cuisine without the land, and there can be no sustainable tourism in the communities that sustain that cultural identity disappeared. That is why I believe the future of culinary tourism in Latin America will depend heavily on our ability to listen more closely to rural, indigenous, and Afro descendant women because they have understood something fundamental for generations, that cooking can also be a way to care the world. And after hearing all these stories, I think one thing is very clear. Women's Network are not only transforming culinary tourism, they are transforming the way we understand territory, memory, and care. Because behind every recipe that survives, behind every preserved seed, behind every traditional cuisine that remains alive, there are women upholding knowledge that for many years was rendered invisible. Women who have cooked even in the midst of hardship. Women who taught without books. Women who feed entire communities without receiving recognition. And women who today are demonstrating that collaboration can also become a form of resistance and territorial development. I deeply believe that the gastronomic tourism of the future needs more humanity, more awareness, and a more genuine connection with the people who make these experiences possible. We need to rely less on consumption and much more on listening. Listening to the stories, listening to the regions, listening to the kitchens, listen to the women who for generations have preserved much of our Latin American culinary heritage. And we also need to understand something very important. When we support a network of women's cooks, we're not just supporting food, we are supporting culture, the local economy, food sovereignty, environmental preservation, and above all, dignity. So, if this episode resonates with you, share it. Send it to someone who loves to travel, cook, or understand Latin America from its deepest roots. I'd love to read them too. Tell me on social media which story moved you the most. Which woman made a difference in your life through her cooking? Or which culinary experience changed the way you see a region? Find me on social media as Tu Viaje Gourmet and also at tatomejia.com. And if you know any project led by women, chefs, farmers, or gardens of tradition in any corner of Latin America, please share them because that's exactly what this space is all about: giving visibility, documenting, and honoring those who sustained our cultural memory through the kitchens, seeds, and collective work. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Bites and Sides. And always remember one thing: sometimes a journey begins with a dish, but the stories that truly transform us almost always begin around a shared kitchen. We'll catch up in the next episode. See you then. If you enjoyed this episode, I invite you to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss the next ones. Also, if you think this content can inspire other travelers or food lovers, please share and comment. It's an incredible way to help more people discover this conscious way of traveling. And with that, we close today's episode. Remember that every trip, every bite, it's an opportunity to connect more deeply with the world around us. So wherever you are, don't stop exploring, tasting, and discovering, because in the end, the best way to get to know a place is by eating it. See you in the next episode. Until then, keep traveling with an open palate and heart.